That is an unauthorized device. Brenda's voice had the grating quality of a rusted hinge, and it cut through the quiet afternoon air like a dull saw. She stood with her hands on her hips, her body forming a perfect, disapproving A-frame on my new driveway. I held up the small, gray plastic rectangle. "It's a gate remote," I said, keeping my own voice level. "It came with the house. 2 of them, in fact." "The bylaws clearly state 1 remote per household," she snapped, her eyes narrowing. "The previous owners were in violation. I am confiscating this as unauthorized HOA property." Before I could even process the sheer absurdity of her statement, her hand shot out and snatched the remote from my grasp. It was a surprisingly swift movement, like a toad catching a fly. She held it up as if it were a captured enemy flag. That was my first real interaction with Brenda, the self-appointed queen of our little gated community. And that was the moment the first crack appeared in the peaceful life I was trying to build. If you're a fan of stories where bullies get exactly what's coming to them, you're going to want to stick around. Make sure you're subscribed, because this is a wild ride. What would you do if someone in your neighborhood acted like they owned you? This whole saga began because I was looking for quiet. My wife, Eleanor, had passed away a year prior after a long illness. The sprawling house we'd shared in the city felt less like a home and more like a museum of grief. Every room held a ghost. Every object whispered a memory. I needed a change of scenery, a place where the echoes of the past weren't quite so loud. This community, with its manicured lawns and promise of security, seemed perfect. It was the last place Eleanor and I had looked at together, a blueprint of a future we never got to build. Buying it felt like honoring her final wish. I was a structural engineer, and the house itself, a solid, well-designed structure, appealed to my professional sensibilities. It was a place with good bones, both literally and figuratively. I just wanted to live in it, tend to the small garden Eleanor had planned, and maybe, eventually, find a new kind of normal. The community was governed by a homeowners association, a fact I was aware of but not particularly concerned about. I've always been a rule follower. Keep your lawn tidy, don't leave your trash cans out, be a decent neighbor. Simple stuff. I figured it would be a non-issue. I had, of course, underestimated the human capacity for petty tyranny. Brenda was the president of that HOA. She was a woman in her late 50s who carried herself with the unearned confidence of a minor dictator. She had a helmet of sprayed blonde hair that looked like it could deflect small arms fire and a wardrobe that consisted exclusively of pastel tracksuits. She didn't walk, she patrolled. Her eyes were constantly scanning for infractions, her lips permanently pursed in a state of preemptive disapproval. She was, in short, a walking, talking violation of the peace I had moved here to find. The confiscation of my gate remote was the opening salvo in a war I didn't even know I was supposed to be fighting. I tried reason first. I attended the next monthly HOA meeting, held in the community clubhouse that smelled faintly of stale coffee and simmering resentment. "Brenda," I began, standing up during the open forum portion. "Regarding the gate remote. I've reviewed the closing documents for my house. The 2 remotes were listed as chattels, part of the sale. They are my personal property." She gave me a condescending smile that didn't reach her cold, reptilian eyes. "Mr. Harrison, you are new here, so I will explain it simply. The bylaws supersede any sale agreement. 1 remote per household. It's for security." "How does my possessing a second remote, which opens my own gate, constitute a security risk?" I asked, genuinely curious about the pretzel logic she was employing. "It's an extra, unaccounted-for device," she said, her voice rising slightly. "It could fall into the wrong hands." "So could my car keys," I countered. "Or the single remote you've graciously allowed me to keep. The point is, it's my property." A murmur went through the dozen or so other homeowners in the room. I saw a few sympathetic nods, but most people were staring intently at their hands, a clear sign they knew better than to get involved. They were a flock of sheep who had long ago accepted the wolf's presence. Brenda's smile vanished, replaced by a hard, flat line. "The board has made its decision. The matter is closed. Now, if there are any real issues to discuss." I sat down, feeling a hot spike of frustration. It wasn't about the remote anymore. It was about the principle. The casual, arrogant theft of my property and the dismissal of my reasonable request. It was a power play, pure and simple. She was marking her territory, and I was the new fire hydrant. That was just the beginning. The escalation was swift and, in its own way, impressively creative. A few days later, I received my first official violation notice, a crisp white envelope slid under my door. It was a $25 fine. The reason? My grass was 3¼ inches high in one measured spot. The maximum allowable height was 3 inches. The notice included a blurry, close-up photograph of a ruler stuck in my lawn as evidence. I mowed my lawn that evening, grinding my teeth with every pass. A week later, another envelope. $50 this time. My trash receptacle was visible from the street for 2 hours past the designated 6 p.m. collection deadline. I had been 15 minutes late getting home from work. Then came the notice about the color of my welcome mat. Apparently, earth tones were the only acceptable palette, and my simple black mat was deemed overly stark and funereal. This was accompanied by a $100 fine. The absurdity was building, layer by layer, like a poorly constructed wall destined to collapse. Each notice felt like a little jab, a reminder of who was in charge. Brenda was digging her grave deeper with every ridiculous citation, she just didn't know it yet. I continued to pay the fines, not wanting to give her any legitimate ammunition. I documented everything, of course. I took pictures of the violation notices, made copies of the cashed checks, and started a file. My professional life was built on documentation and precision. It was a habit I couldn't shake. Every blueprint, every stress calculation, every material specification had to be perfect. I started applying the same meticulousness to Brenda's reign of terror. The file grew thicker. The turning point, the moment my passive frustration curdled into cold, calculated resolve, came about a month into this nonsense. It wasn't a fine or a notice. It was far more personal. My daughter, Chloe, came to visit with her 5-year-old son, Leo. It was the first time they'd seen the new house, and I was excited to show them the garden, the one place I felt Eleanor's spirit most strongly. Leo was riding his little tricycle on the sidewalk in front of my house. He wasn't in the street, wasn't making noise, wasn't bothering a soul. He was just a little kid, pedaling in happy, wobbly circles. Brenda appeared as if summoned from the earth itself. She marched right up to my daughter. "You need to take him inside," she commanded, not even bothering with a greeting. Chloe, who inherited her mother's gentle nature but my stubborn streak, was taken aback. "I'm sorry, is there a problem?" "Wheeled toys are not permitted on community sidewalks," Brenda declared, pointing a talon-like finger at the tricycle. "It's a liability issue. And a nuisance." "A nuisance?" "He's 5, Chloe said, her voice tight with disbelief. "The rules are for everyone's safety and comfort," Brenda said, puffing out her chest. "Take the vehicle inside. Now." I had been watching from the porch, and that was it. The line had been crossed. You can fine me for the height of my grass, you can legislate the color of my doormat, but you do not harass my family. You do not talk to my daughter that way. You do not ruin my grandson's day. I walked down the steps, my movements calm and deliberate. Inside, a switch had flipped. The part of my brain that calculates load-bearing capacities and structural failure points was now fully engaged, but it wasn't analyzing concrete and steel. It was analyzing Brenda. "Brenda," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "You will apologize to my daughter. And then you will leave my property." She turned to me, a smirk playing on her lips. "Or what?" "You'll get another fine. This time for threatening a board member." "That wasn't a threat," I said, stepping between her and my family. "It was a structural forecast. You're building a house of cards on a faulty foundation. I suggest you walk away before it all comes down on top of you." My engineering metaphor seemed to fly right over her perfectly coiffed head. She just scoffed, gave Leo's tricycle one last dirty look, and marched off down the street, no doubt to draft another violation notice. But I had seen the flicker of unease in her eyes. And more importantly, I had seen the look on my daughter's face, and the way my grandson's smile had vanished. That was the catalyst. My quest for peace was over. It was time to go to war. Brenda had pushed too far, and now I was going to become a proactive strategist. My initial annoyance had blossomed into a full-blown mission. I was no longer just defending my property, I was going on the offensive. That night, after Chloe and Leo had gone home, I sat in my study and opened the file I'd been keeping. It was no longer just a record of harassment, it was a project brief. Project Demolition, I called it. The objective, the complete and total dismantling of Brenda's little empire. And I, the structural engineer, was going to be the architect of her downfall. My first step was to move beyond her petty violations and investigate the structure of the HOA itself. Power like Brenda's rarely exists in a vacuum. It needs a framework to support it, and I intended to find the weak points in that framework. I started with the public records. I spent a Saturday morning at the county clerk's office, pulling the original development plans for the community, the HOA incorporation documents, and the property deeds for all the common areas. It was tedious work, sifting through pages of legal jargon and surveyor's maps, but my engineering career had trained me for this. Finding a critical flaw in a 1,000-page blueprint is what I do. And in the dusty archives of the county office, I found the first hairline crack in Brenda's foundation. The main gate, the very symbol of Brenda's authority, was not, as everyone assumed, on HOA property. According to the original plat maps, the 10-foot-wide strip of land that the gate, the keypad, and the electronic control box sat on was a municipal utility easement. The HOA didn't own it. The city did. The HOA had a license to operate and maintain the gate, but they had no more legal authority over that patch of land than I did. This was interesting. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was a loose bolt in the machinery. Next, I dove into the HOA's finances. As a homeowner, I was entitled to review the annual budgets. I requested the last 5 years' worth of financial statements. They were a mess of confusing line items and vague expenses, but one thing stood out: a massive capital expenditure 3 years ago. $150,000 for a full security gate system upgrade. This piqued my interest. I'm an engineer. I know what these systems cost. $150,000 was an astronomical sum for a single entry gate in a community of our size. It should have bought us a system worthy of Fort Knox, complete with retinal scanners and anti-tank barriers. Yet our gate was a simple, creaky swing arm that often got stuck in a light breeze. I needed to see the hardware for myself. One night, around 2 a.m., I took a walk down to the gate. Armed with a high-powered flashlight and a set of tools, I opened the control box. The lock was a joke, a standard tumbler I could have picked with a paperclip. Inside was a mess of wiring, but the core components, the motor, the control board, the radio receiver, were immediately recognizable. They were old. Not just old, but the original, bottom-of-the-line models that would have been installed when the community was built 15 years ago. There was dust, cobwebs, and even a small, mummified frog inside. There was absolutely nothing that looked like it had been upgraded 3 years ago. The buzzing in the air felt like static before a lightning strike. This was it. This was more than just petty tyranny. $150,000 had vanished into thin air. Brenda hadn't just been a bully, she was a thief. Her motivation wasn't just power and control, it was good old-fashioned financial gain. I took detailed photographs of everything inside the control box, capturing serial numbers, manufacturer dates, and the general state of decay. I compared them to the parts list from the original developer's plans I'd gotten from the county. They were a perfect match. No upgrade. No new system. Just a phantom invoice and $150,000 missing dollars. My investigation needed a human element. I needed an ally. I found one in Frank, my next-door neighbor. Frank was a retired police detective in his late 60s, a quiet man who spent most of his days tending his prize-winning roses. He'd seen my run-ins with Brenda and had offered a few words of gruff sympathy. I decided it was time to bring him in. I invited him over for a beer, laid out my files on the dining room table, and walked him through everything I'd found. The property map showing the easement. The budget with the phantom upgrade. The pictures of the ancient gate mechanism. Frank listened patiently, his detective's eyes scanning the documents. He picked up one of the photos, squinting at the control board. "Classic embezzlement," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It's the oldest play in the book for small-time crooks. You create a big, scary expense, something nobody understands the technical details of, and you pay a fake invoice to a company you control. So what do I do? I asked. Go to the police. Frank shook his head. Not yet. White-collar crime is tricky. You've got strong circumstantial evidence, but you don't have the direct link. You can't prove who cashed the check. The DA's office is overworked. They might look at this, shrug, and say it's a civil matter. You need to build an ironclad case. You need to bait the trap. His words resonated with me. This wasn't just a legal problem anymore, it was an engineering problem. I needed to design a structure, a trap, so perfectly that when the load was applied, the failure would be catastrophic and absolute. The plan began to form in my mind, a blueprint of poetic justice. I was going to use Brenda's own weapon, her obsession with rules and control, against her. The gate was the source of her power and her crime. The gate would be the instrument of her undoing. I have an idea, I said to Frank, a slow smile spreading across my face. But I'm going to need to do some unauthorized maintenance. Frank took a long sip of his beer. Just don't leave any fingerprints, he said with a wink. Phase 1 of my plan was setting the stage. I needed to create a situation that would force Brenda to act rashly and incriminate herself. My professional knowledge of electronics and control systems was about to become my primary weapon. Over the next week, I made several more late-night visits to the gate's control box. My first task was to install a small, motion-activated spy camera. I found a model online that was no bigger than a sugar cube, with a battery life of several weeks. I concealed it inside the housing, drilling a minuscule hole that gave it a perfect view of the control panel and anyone standing in front of it. Any future maintenance would now be documented. My second task was more technical. I studied the schematics for the gate's radio receiver. It was an old, simple system. I realized I could build a secondary, overriding controller. It was a simple bit of engineering. I bought the components online for less than $50. I assembled a small device that I could activate remotely. When triggered, it would completely disable the main radio receiver, rendering all the residents' gate remotes, including Brenda's, useless. The gate would be frozen, either open or shut, until I deactivated my device. I had created a kill switch. The final piece of the trap was psychological. I needed to poke the bear. I drafted a formal, registered letter addressed to the entire HOA board, with a specific copy sent directly to Brenda. In the letter, I presented myself as a concerned homeowner and a professional engineer. I wrote that, in the interest of community safety, I had performed a cursory visual inspection of the gate mechanism. I stated that the system appeared to be severely outdated and potentially unreliable. I then referenced the $150,000 upgrade from 3 years ago and politely requested a copy of the engineering specifications, the contractor's warranty, and the maintenance logs for the new system. I described my request as a necessary step for ensuring our capital investments are performing as expected. I used all the bland, corporate jargon I knew she'd both hate and be intimidated by. I was questioning her authority and her competence in the most clinical, detached way possible. I signed it, sent it via registered mail to ensure a record of receipt, and then I waited. It took less than 48 hours for the bear to roar. An email blast went out to the entire community. Urgent and mandatory HOA meeting, the subject line screamed in all caps. The body of the email, written in a florid and hysterical tone that was unmistakably Brenda's, announced a special meeting to address recent, baseless accusations and malicious attacks on the integrity of your volunteer board. It was scheduled for the following Wednesday. She was going to try and humiliate me publicly. It was exactly what I had hoped for. The trap was set. The night of the meeting, the clubhouse was packed. Brenda had clearly whipped the sheep into a state of anxious curiosity. She sat at the head of a long table with the other 4 board members, who all looked profoundly uncomfortable. I took a seat in the front row, a slim briefcase on my lap. Frank gave me a subtle nod from the back of the room. Brenda opened the meeting with a 20-minute tirade about her tireless dedication, her unpaid hours of service, and the vicious, unfounded rumors being spread by certain individuals who don't respect our community's values. She never used my name, but she looked directly at me the entire time. When she finally finished her self-aggrandizing monologue, she said, "The board will now address the frivolous and insulting letter we received." She held up my letter as if it were contaminated. "We have a response. She then introduced a man named Barry, a slick, smarmy-looking individual she identified as our security consultant. Barry, it turned out, was the owner of Secure Home Solutions, the company that had supposedly performed the gate upgrade. Barry launched into a presentation filled with technical-sounding gibberish. He talked about encrypted frequency hopping, multispectrum signal integrity, and proactive perimeter defense. It was a word salad designed to confuse and impress the non-technical audience. He concluded by assuring everyone that their gate was state-of-the-art and that the $150,000 had been a bargain. "Are there any questions?" Brenda asked, a triumphant smirk on her face. I slowly raised my hand. "I have one." All eyes turned to me. I stood up and walked to the front of the room, placing my briefcase on the table. "Mr. Barry," I began, my voice calm and even. "That was a very impressive presentation. You used a lot of big words. But I'm a simple engineer. I prefer to deal with facts and physical evidence." I opened my briefcase and pulled out a large, poster-sized printout. It was the original developer's blueprint of the gate mechanism. I tacked it to the bulletin board behind the table. "This," I said, pointing to the diagram, "is the system that was installed when this community was built. Note the model numbers on the motor and the control board." Then, I pulled out a second poster. It was a series of high-resolution photographs I had taken inside the control box 2 weeks earlier. I tacked it up next to the blueprint. "And this," I said, my voice ringing with clarity, "is the system that is in there right now." I used a laser pointer to circle the corresponding parts. As you can all see, the model numbers are identical. The components are identical. They are, in fact, the exact same 15-year-old parts. So my question, Mr. Barry, is simple. What, precisely, did the homeowners get for their $150,000? A collective gasp went through the room. Barry's face went pale. He stammered, "Well, the internal software. The firmware. It's all new." "The firmware?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "On a 2008 model analog control board. That's fascinating. You must have invented time travel to go along with your state-of-the-art security. Because that board isn't capable of running new firmware. It's a glorified garage door opener." Brenda leaped to her feet. "This is an outrage. You have no right to tamper with HOA property. You've been snooping around, breaking into things. You're the one who should be investigated." Her reaction was exactly what I had anticipated. Denial, rage, and counter-accusation. She was losing control, and her social credibility was cracking like cheap concrete under a seismic load. The other board members were shrinking in their chairs, trying to become invisible. "I didn't tamper with anything, Brenda," I said coolly. "The control box was unlocked. As for my right, as a fee-paying member of this association, I have every right to question where my money is going. Especially when it appears to have vanished into a company that, according to state business records, was incorporated just 1 month before the upgrade and dissolved 6 months after the check was cashed." I let that hang in the air for a moment. The room was dead silent. "And one more thing," I added, looking at Barry. "I found it very interesting that the registered agent for Secure Home Solutions has the same last name as you, Brenda. In fact, he has the same address as your brother. Is that just a coincidence?" That was the kill shot. Brenda's face went from red to a blotchy, unhealthy white. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She had been publicly unmasked, not as a thief yet, but as a liar and a probable fraud. The meeting descended into chaos. People were shouting questions. The board members were trying to calm everyone down. I just packed up my posters, closed my briefcase, and walked out. The first phase of Project Demolition was complete. I had exposed the lie. Now, I just had to wait for her to make her next, more desperate move. And I knew she would. Cornered animals are always the most vicious. Brenda's retaliation was faster and more vicious than I could have imagined. She was no longer operating with the petty tyranny of fines and warnings. This was a full-on, scorched-earth campaign to destroy my reputation and drive me out of the community. The day after the meeting, a post appeared on the community's private Facebook page. It was written by Brenda. She accused me of being a disgruntled and unstable individual who was endangering the safety of our children. She claimed my late-night snooping around the gate was proof of my devious intentions. She painted me as a predator, a creep who lurked in the shadows. It was a classic smear campaign, designed to isolate me and turn my neighbors against me. Some of the residents, the ones who had been under her thumb for years, chimed in with supportive comments. But many were silent. The seed of doubt I had planted at the meeting was starting to grow. People were beginning to question her narrative. Then she escalated again. She filed a formal police report against me for vandalism and trespassing. 2 uniformed officers showed up at my door the next evening. They were polite but firm. "Sir, we have a complaint that you tampered with the community gates control mechanism," the older officer said. I invited them in and offered them coffee. I calmly explained the situation. I told them I was a structural engineer and had been investigating potential financial mismanagement by the HOA board. I showed them my documentation, the blueprints, the photos, my registered letter to the board. I opened an unlocked control box to verify the presence of equipment the homeowners paid for, I explained. I did not damage or alter anything. I was exercising my due diligence as a member of the association. Frank, my retired detective neighbor, had seen the police car and came over. He knew both officers by name. He vouched for me, explaining the context of the HOA dispute. The officers listened, their expressions shifting from suspicion to understanding. They took my statement, reviewed my documents, and left. They told me the complaint seemed thin and was likely a civil matter, but they had to file a report. Brenda's attempt to use the law against me had failed, but it was a clear sign of her desperation. Filing a false police report was a serious crime in itself. She was no longer just a thief, she was compounding her felonies. She was making my case for me. The final piece of the puzzle, the smoking gun that would connect all the dots, came from an unexpected source. It came from a man named George, the HOA treasurer. George was a quiet, mousy accountant who had been on the board for years. He was a classic enabler, the kind of weak-willed person who goes along with a bully because it's easier than standing up to them. The police report was his breaking point. He saw that Brenda was willing to ruin an innocent person's life to cover her tracks, and his conscience finally won out over his fear. He slipped a plain manila envelope under my door late one night. There was no note, just a USB drive inside. I plugged it into my computer, my heart pounding with a tense anticipation. The drive contained scanned copies of everything. The original, fraudulent invoice from Secura Home Solutions, the cancelled check from the HOA's bank account for $150,000. And the final, damning piece of evidence, the deposit slip. The check had been deposited into the bank account of the Shell Corporation, and the bank records showed a series of subsequent transfers. $50,000 had been wired to Brenda's brother, Barry. And $100,000 had been transferred directly into a private investment account under one name, Brenda. It was all there, in black and white. A direct, undeniable trail of stolen money. George, the whistleblower, had given me the keys to the kingdom. He had also included a short, typed, and signed note. She told me it was a consultant's fee. I always had my doubts. The police report was too much. Do what's right. I'll testify if I have to. Now I had her. The case wasn't just circumstantial anymore. It was ironclad. This wasn't a civil matter for the HOA to handle. This was felony embezzlement. Wire fraud. Conspiracy. I called Frank immediately. He came over, and we reviewed the contents of the USB drive together. His eyes widened as he saw the bank records. Game, set, and match, he said, a grim smile on his face. She's going to prison for a long, long time. The next morning, Frank and I went to the district attorney's office. We didn't go to the local police precinct. Frank knew that white-collar crime needed to go to the specialists. We met with an assistant district attorney in the economic crimes unit. I laid out the entire story, from the stolen gate remote to the contents of the USB drive. I presented my evidence systematically, like I was presenting a structural analysis report. I gave her the timeline, the photos, the financial statements, and the bank records. The ADA, a sharp woman in her 40s, listened intently, her expression growing more serious with each document I produced. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair. "Mr. Harrison," she said. This is one of the cleanest cases of small-scale public corruption I've ever seen. You've done 90% of our work for us. She told us they would open a formal investigation immediately. They would subpoena the official bank records to corroborate George's copies, but she had no doubt they would match. An arrest was imminent. However, she said, a strategic glint in her eye. Her public meltdown at that meeting was very effective. It showed her character. I'd like to arrange for a similar outcome for her arrest. Public officials, even petty ones like an HOA president, should be held accountable publicly. It sends a message. And that's when we devised the plan for the final showdown. The annual HOA budget meeting was in 2 weeks. It was a mandatory meeting for all board members, and usually well attended by residents. It was the perfect stage. The DA's office would have 2 plainclothes detectives in the audience. They would let me present my findings to the community, and when the time was right, they would make the arrest. It was perfect. Brenda's downfall would be as public as her reign of terror had been. The same people she had bullied and intimidated would be there to witness her complete and utter humiliation. The cold satisfaction I felt was immense. This was the final phase of my project. The demolition was scheduled. The night of the annual meeting arrived, thick with a palpable tension. The clubhouse was standing room only. Word had spread that something big was going to happen. Brenda and the board sat at the front table, trying to project an air of normalcy, but the strain was visible on their faces. Brenda, in a particularly garish pink tracksuit, looked like a cornered animal. Her eyes darted around the room, settling on me with a look of pure venom. The meeting began with the usual droning on about landscaping budgets and pool maintenance schedules. I let it play out, letting the tension build. Finally, the floor was opened for new business. I stood up. I have some new business to discuss, I said, my voice carrying across the silent room. It concerns the financial health and integrity of our community. Brenda immediately tried to shut me down. Mr. Harrison, you are out of order. We have already addressed your baseless allegations. I don't think you have, I said, walking to the front. I was carrying a laptop and a small projector. But I'm going to address them now. In full. Before she could object further, I had my laptop connected and an image projected onto the screen behind her. It was a high-resolution scan of the $150,000 invoice from Secure Home Solutions. We've all heard about the gate upgrade, I began, my voice steady and clear. The one that cost this community a fortune. I've already presented evidence that this upgrade never happened. But the question remained, where did the money go? I clicked to the next slide. It was a copy of the cancelled check, made out to Barry's company. Then, the next slide, the deposit slip into the company's account. The money went here, I said, pointing my laser at the screen. Into a shell corporation owned by Brenda's brother, who, I might add, has no experience in security systems. His actual profession is dog grooming. A wave of shocked laughter rippled through the audience. Brenda was on her feet, her face purple with rage. This is illegal. You have illegally obtained these documents. They're forgeries. Are they, Brenda? I asked calmly. I glanced towards the back of the room, where George, the treasurer, was sitting. He looked terrified, but he gave a small, determined nod. He was ready to do the right thing. Perhaps your treasurer, Mr. Smith, can attest to their authenticity, I said. All eyes turned to George. He stood up, trembling slightly. They are authentic, he stammered. I provided them. I couldn't be a party to this any longer. Brenda looked at George with a gaze so hateful it could have curdled milk. You sniveling little rat, she shrieked. You're finished. No, Brenda, I said, my voice cutting through her tirade. You are. I clicked to the final, most damning piece of evidence. The money didn't stay in the corporate account for long, I explained. It was moved. 50,000 to your brother, and 100,000 inch. I put the final slide up. It was the bank statement from her personal investment account, showing the $100,000 deposit. Into your personal account, Brenda. This wasn't a bad business deal. This was theft. You stole from your neighbors. You stole from every single person in this room. The room erupted. The carefully constructed facade of Brenda's authority crumbled into dust in an instant. Her supporters looked horrified. Her victims looked vindicated. And then, Brenda completely and utterly lost her mind. The mask of the composed, in-control tyrant fell away, revealing the screeching, pathetic fraud underneath. "You're all a bunch of ungrateful idiots," she screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria. "I built this community. I keep it safe. I deserve that money. I earned it for putting up with all of you." It was a full confession, screamed in a room full of witnesses. It was more than the DA could have ever hoped for. As she ranted, two figures stood up from the audience. A man and a woman in plain clothes. The detectives. They walked calmly to the front of the room. "Brenda," the male detective said, his voice calm but firm. "You are under arrest for embezzlement, wire fraud, and conspiracy." He pulled out a pair of handcuffs. The sight of the steel cuffs seemed to finally break through Brenda's rage. Her face went slack with shock and disbelief. "You can't do this," she whimpered as the detective cuffed her hands behind her back. "I am the president." "Not anymore, you're not," the detective said flatly. They led her out of the clubhouse, past the stunned faces of the neighbors she had terrorized for years. As they passed me, she stopped and turned, her face a contorted mask of hatred. "You'll regret this," she hissed, her voice a low, venomous whisper. "I'll sue you for everything you have. I'll own your house." It was her last, impotent threat. A final, hollow echo of a power that no longer existed. I just looked at her, held her gaze, and said nothing. I didn't have to. The sound of the clicking handcuffs and the stunned silence of the room said it all. The demolition was complete. The structure had failed, and the tyrant had fallen. The aftermath was swift and decisive. The community, finally liberated from Brenda's rule, began to heal. The remaining board members, tainted by their association with her, resigned in disgrace within a week. An emergency election was held, and a new board of competent, reasonable people was voted in. One of them was Frank, who reluctantly agreed to serve as president, just to get things back on track. The first order of business for the new board was a full, independent audit of the HOA's finances for the past decade. It uncovered several other smaller instances of Brenda's creative accounting, all of which were added to the DA's growing case against her. Brenda's fate was sealed. Faced with the mountain of evidence I had gathered and George's testimony, she had no choice but to take a plea deal. She was convicted on multiple felony counts and sentenced to 5 years in state prison. Her brother, Barry the dog groomer, was convicted of conspiracy and received a lighter sentence of probation and a hefty fine. The court ordered them to pay full restitution. The $150,000, plus interest and penalties, was returned to the HOA's coffers. Brenda's assets were seized, including her house in the community, which was sold at auction to cover her legal fees and the restitution. She lost everything: her money, her power, her home, her freedom. It was a complete and total ruin, a perfect example of poetic justice. The community began to change for the better. The new board, led by Frank, went through the bylaws with a fine-toothed comb, eliminating the absurd, petty rules Brenda had instituted. The atmosphere of fear and suspicion was replaced by one of cooperation and neighborliness. People started talking to each other again. Kids' tricycles reappeared on the sidewalks. The recovered funds were put to good use. The board hired a reputable, legitimate security firm to do what should have been done years ago. They installed a brand new, truly state-of-the-art gate system. It was quiet, efficient, and secure. A few weeks after it was installed, Frank knocked on my door. He was holding a small box. "The board thought you should have this," he said, handing it to me. Inside was a brand new, shiny gate remote. And right next to it was a second one. "We voted unanimously," he said with a smile. 2 remotes per household is now the official policy. I took them, feeling a wave of quiet satisfaction. It was never about the remote, but its return felt like the final, closing chapter of the whole sordid affair. I became something of a reluctant local hero. People would wave as I drove by. Neighbors would stop me to thank me for what I did. I appreciated the sentiment, but I never sought the attention. I wasn't a hero, I was just a man who had been pushed too far. I was an engineer who saw a faulty structure and felt compelled to bring it down before it hurt anyone else. Sometimes, I sit on my porch in the evening, the same porch where I watched Brenda harass my daughter. I look out at the peaceful, quiet street. I listen to the gentle hum of the new gate opening and closing. The community is now the sanctuary I had hoped it would be, the place of peace Eleanor and I had dreamed of. I learned a valuable lesson through all this. I had moved here seeking to avoid conflict, to live a quiet life. But I discovered that true peace isn't about the absence of conflict. It's about the strength to confront injustice when it lands on your doorstep. It's about the willingness to stand up to bullies, not with fists and fury, but with patience, with logic, and with a meticulously prepared blueprint for their downfall. Brenda thought her power was absolute, but she built her empire on a foundation of lies and theft. And as any good engineer knows, a structure with a faulty foundation is doomed to collapse. I just helped it along.